Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And it's back to the continued fighting around Avdiivka. We can say now in and around Avdiivka, as the Russians have moved actually into the very outskirts of Avdiivka. We believe at this point there are Russian special operations forces now operating inside of Avdiivka itself. Now, we have seen the narrative start to change for the Ukrainian military. At the onset of the Russian offensive around Avdiivka, the Ukrainians were claiming that Avdiivka would not fall, that it was essentially a fortress city and it was going to maintain. Now, that narrative is now changing to one of that the Ukrainian military is draining Russian forces as the Russians continue to encircle Avdiivka. The Ukrainian narrative is portraying that the Russians are taking utter catastrophic casualties, large numbers of casualties, as the noose tightens around Avdiivka. Now, is that the case? Are the Russians really losing as many personnel as the Ukrainians are claiming? I think one source from Ukraine states that up to 8,000 Russian forces have been killed in the ongoing Russian offensive. Now, we don't know if that's true or not. Obviously, the Ukrainian narrative right now is one that makes it appear that it will be a Russian Pyrrhic victory, that the cost of Russian lives and equipment will vastly outweigh the magnitude of success in terms of the Russians seizing control of the town. But make no mistake, the Ukrainians absolutely did not want to lose Avdiivka, and they have done everything in their power in an attempt to hold on to Avdiivka. Now, yes, early in the Russian offensive, we saw the Russians maneuver and we saw the Russians take losses in tanks and materiel. That strategy has changed, and it's more of a methodical, plotting strategy in which they are using large amounts of artillery and ground attack aircraft to locate, isolate, and then destroy Ukrainian forces in this pocket. And again, guys, this is a very tough situation if you are in the Ukrainian military. The noose continues to tighten. The ability of Ukrainian forces to reinforce and provide equipment, water, food to these Ukrainian units. And let's go to the actual deployment map where you, the viewer, can kind of see what exactly is happening on the ground, and you can see the actual units the Ukrainians have in this pocket now. So essentially, elements of a multitude of brigades. We understand actually some of these units were moved from the southern Zaporizhzhia sector in order to try and prevent the Russians from taking Avdiivka. Some of the main units, obviously here is the 53rd Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian military, elements of the 501st Marine Battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade, the 70th Separate Infantry Battalion. It's a special police company of the, I believe, the Ukrainian National Guard. You have an element of the Fire Brigade, the 1st Tank Brigade of the Ukrainian military, the 116th Territorial Defense Brigade. But there are additional units that are not being cited that we know have been deployed in this pocket to try and prevent the collapse of the Avdiivka pocket. If we go over to the Rondelli Foundation, again, essentially the same thing. Very precarious situation for the Ukrainian military. The only strategy right now the Ukrainians could undertake to prevent what is eventually going to happen, that's going to be the fall of Avdiivka, would be to counterattack on these Russian salients to the south and to the north and try to push these Russian forces back. We are not seeing that capability as of yet. Again, it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to move over these relatively flat surfaces. Just as the Russians had difficulty attacking Avdiivka with large maneuver elements, it's the same for the Ukrainians as well. It's this ability to sense and shoot in real time. And when the Ukrainians bring up their forces and attempt to counterattack, whether it be south or north of Avdiivka, they come under immediate and withering Russian artillery attack helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft. So it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to counterattack in some of these locales. We've seen isolated, small, company-sized elements of Ukrainian forces attempt some minor counterattacks, but that is about it. And the Russians continue with offensive operations around Avdiivka. And again, the noose is tightening, and I am not completely buying the fact that is being reported by the Ukrainians that the Russians are losing that amount of personnel as we speak. Possibly in the early stages of the Avdiivka offensive, but right now the Russians have switched over to a very methodical campaign in which they are using its overwhelming superiority in artillery and air power to reduce, degrade, and destroy the Ukrainian military in the Avdiivka pocket. It's just what's happening. Now, yes, the political spin, the political narrative by Western nation states is going to be one that, hey, the Russians are taking lots of casualties. We don't know what those casualties are, but we believe, generally speaking, it's a 3-to-1 ratio based on historical past performance of offensive forces fighting a dug-in defensive force. But you can't completely look at it like that because the Russians are using different tactics right now in Avdiivka, and again, specifically bombarding the living hell out of Ukrainian forces that are in these pockets. So there's days where the Ukrainians, in all probability, are actually taking more casualties than Russian forces because the Russians are not always maneuvering day in and day out. They're using heavy artillery and aircraft to isolate and destroy Ukrainian forces in this pocket, and that's just what's happening. Additionally, the war continues on other fronts as well. We continue to see fighting in the south, albeit not the same offensive operations by the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhzhia offensive. Again, we believe that has failed. We are also seeing less talk about this Ukrainian landing operation that took place on the western bank of the Dnieper River. Again, small units of Ukrainian military forces landed. They did not land heavy equipment. They've landed small platoon and company-sized elements of infantry in these areas. These are forces that cannot continue offensive operations and take and even threaten areas near the Crimean Peninsula, much less take the key town of Oleshki. The Russians still control Oleshki, and there is no sign that Oleshki is being threatened by any unit of the Ukrainian military. So again, with the defeat of the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhzhia, and make no mistake, we are trying to analyze this in our most unbiased and professional means possible. The Ukrainians sustained a military defeat in the Zaporizhzhia counteroffensive. It failed. The Russians have now gone on the offensive in areas such as Avdiivka and further to the north, and Kupiansk. And we will continue to see the Russians conduct those operations as we continue to see the expansion of the Russian military. Now, it'll be interesting to see what happens here in the United States. There's a lot of pressure by the Democrats to include support of Israel, to also include supporting the Ukrainians, meaning that if the United States wants Israel to be supported, then the United States is going to have to support the Ukrainians. And there are a very large number of Americans who do not agree with this unbridled support to the Ukrainians, especially if we look at end games. And the Russians have dug in. They are not going to lose this war. They will continue to fight in perpetuity until the Ukrainian military collapses, or the United States citizenry grow tired of this conflict and want nothing more in terms of providing treasure to the Ukrainian state. And again, based on what we know about the Ukrainian state being incredibly corrupt, with many Ukrainians not even wanting to live there, taking this opportunity to vacate their own country and not fight for their own country, then why should the United States send resources to Ukraine? I do not buy that if Ukraine were to fall, and I don't believe all of Ukraine would fall to Russian forces, that we would be facing a Russian attack against Poland. I do not believe that the Russians would be successful in a military operation against Poland, especially, obviously, if other NATO nation states, to include the United States, decide to directly lend direct military support to the Poles. Completely different scenario, and you cannot compare and contrast and say, well, just because the Russians have taken Ukraine, they are going to take Poland. Look, we have a treaty with Poland. We, the United States, do not have a treaty with the Ukrainians. We don't. Could we defend Poland from the Russians? Yes, absolutely. But it is in our interest to defend Ukraine from the Russians. I think that's being debated. Ultimately, the Russian perception is they have to win this war. And it's a cost versus benefit scenario. Is the benefit of supporting the Ukrainians in this war, is the cost going to benefit the United States? And I would have to say at this point, the answer is no. That's where we're at for today. We will continue to monitor and report. Thank you for joining us. More to come in the near future. As always, have a good day.